Every doorstep had a coin, but none of them bought silence. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'm curious. Where in the world are you listening from today? It's always a pleasure to read your comments and connect with you. Let's begin. It was raining again. Not a storm, not even a downpour. Just a persistent drizzle that had begun sometime during the night and now clung to the morning like a damp shawl. From the window of his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Chief Inspector Maigret watched as water gathered in the seams of the street and ran in crooked silver threads toward the gutter. The chestnut trees outside were motionless, their trunks blackened with moisture. A dog nosed through a pile of leaves across the road, then sneezed and moved on. Inside, the radiators gave off a soft ticking sound as they cooled, and from the kitchen came the smell of boiled coffee and the faint clink of porcelain. Madame Maigret was at the stove, humming quietly to herself, not a tune so much as a kind of habitual comfort. Maigret was in shirt sleeves, his suspenders tight against his shoulders, seated at the small table where they always had breakfast. A cigarette burned slowly in the ashtray, untouched. His large hands were clasped loosely in front of him. He had been awake for some time now, though not fully. That strange middle ground between sleeping and thinking, where nothing was urgent, but everything hovered. There was no case, at least not yet. He had come off a particularly drawn-out investigation the week before. A shopkeeper in Montmartre found dead behind his register, which had been emptied of just 12 francs, the sort of case the press made loud for lack of material. It had been solved, quietly and without satisfaction. A drifter, a broken man, the kind of truth that never made headlines. And now the silence had returned, to the office, to his phone, to his own mind, and Maigret found himself adrift as he often did in the spaces between crimes. "Did you see?" his wife asked softly, setting a bowl of sugar beside the coffee. "The envelope?" He looked up, his expression barely shifting. "What envelope?" She gestured with her chin toward the door. "This morning, on the doormat. I thought it might be one of those subscription things, but there was nothing inside. Just a coin." He got up, slowly, the floorboards creaking under his feet. On the mat, just past the umbrella stand, lay a plain, cream envelope, unmarked. Inside was a single 5-franc piece, worn, a little dulled at the edges. Nothing else. He turned it in his fingers, frowning without urgency. "Odd," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "No." She shook her head. It was sealed, too. I had to tear it open. Maigret studied the envelope again. It was ordinary stationery. No crest, no perfume, no trace of handwriting. The glue had been licked, not taped. He could still smell it faintly, that slight tang of paper and something metallic. He left the envelope on the mantel and poured his coffee. But something in the act felt changed, as if the day had chosen a direction without asking him, as if a small stone had been dropped into the pond of routine, and now ripples were moving outward, slow but certain. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the envelope had not left his pocket. The headquarters were as they always were in the morning. The scent of stale tobacco, paper, wet wool. Upstairs, Lucas was going through the motions of a quiet day, checking call logs, reading over petty reports. Geneviève was late. Lepontry was recovering from a head cold and likely still in bed. Even Inspector Lognon had not yet arrived, though the man had developed the habit of sulking through doors like a man owed something by the world. It was only when Maigret was taking off his overcoat that the phone rang. Not his private line, not the commissioner's, but one of the outer lines near the front desk. It rang twice, then 3 times. No one answered. He crossed to the hall himself, lit a match, and held the flame to his pipe. The desk sergeant looked up from a crossword and gestured vaguely toward the receiver. Maigret picked it up. Quai des Orfèvres. Maigret. A pause, then a voice. Dry, male, older, spoke, low and without urgency. "I only leave them for those who understand why." Another pause, a click. The line went dead. Maigret stood still, the receiver still pressed to his ear, though the silence was total. He didn't call the number back. He didn't need to. There had been no number, just a voice, hovering like mist at the edge of comprehension. He hung up and went back to his office. He took out the envelope again and laid the coin on the blotter. It was not valuable, not ancient, just a 5-franc piece. The kind schoolboys spent on sweets or bus fare. He stared at it for a long while. Later that morning, Lucas entered with a thin smile and a stack of reports, each duller than the last. But Maigret barely noticed. He had opened the window slightly, just enough to let the smell of rain creep in. Below, the sign moved sluggishly under a veil of mist. The city had no urgency that day. Neither did he. But something, a scent, a sentence, a coin was already threading its way into his awareness. Not a case yet, not a crime. But something had begun. And Maigret, as always, would wait. Not just with patience, but with presence. Because the world, when left to itself, always told the truth. In whispers, in weather, in envelopes that held only a coin. The next morning brought no sunshine, only a grayer shade of gray. The city exhaled cold dampness through its narrow arteries. The streets slick with yesterday's rain, the air heavy with unwashed windows and morning coal smoke. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres without speaking to anyone, nodding only once to the concierge as he passed. He carried no umbrella, just his overcoat collar turned up and his pipe between his teeth, though he had not yet lit it. The coin in his coat pocket pressed against his thigh with a weight out of proportion to its size. Inside, the building was half awake. A typist coughed dryly in the corner, and the sound of a distant door closing echoed faintly through the corridor. Maigret walked slowly to his office, his shoes leaving quiet wet prints on the tile, and removed his coat with a kind of absent-minded ritual. Once seated, he pulled the envelope from the drawer, studied it again, then drew the coin across the blotter with one thick finger. It made the faintest scraping sound. Lucas knocked gently and entered without waiting for an answer. "Nothing urgent," he said, placing a folded sheet of paper on the desk. "A woman came in an hour ago to report a burglary, but it was just a neighbor's child taking biscuits, and a man in the 11th who says someone's poisoning his cat." Maigret nodded, but did not touch the report. Lucas hesitated. "You're not working on anything else, are you?" Maigret let the silence hold for a moment too long, then said mildly, "No, just watching." Lucas gave the barest smile, familiar with the tone, and left. It wasn't a case. Not yet. But it wouldn't leave Maigret's mind. He had handled thousands of francs in bribes and evidence over the years, crisp new bills, grubby coins hidden in mattress seams, a handful of centimetres offered in pathetic desperation. But this coin, clean, ordinary, offered without explanation, felt like a question asked in a language no one had taught him. By mid-morning he had asked Lapointe, newly returned and red-nosed from his illness, to quietly check with the concierge of his building. Had anyone been seen placing the envelope? Any unfamiliar visitors? Lapointe came back an hour later with a shrug and damp shoulders. "She says the hallway was empty before 6. I asked the newspaper boy too." Nothing. Maigret lit his pipe at last. No one ever sees the ordinary things. That's why they work. He didn't explain what he meant. It was past noon when the second call came. Maigret had left his office only for a moment to stand at the open window and smoke. The pipe warm against his palm, he heard the phone ringing behind him. Not urgent, but deliberate. He returned to the desk, lifted the receiver. "I thought it would be harder," the voice said. It was the same one, dry, calm, almost bored. "They never ask why. They only count." Then the line clicked and silence returned. Maigret replaced the receiver slowly, his eyes narrowing. He tapped the pipe once against the rim of the ashtray. Though it still had tobacco left in it, he knew better than to trace a call like that. No exchange, no name, just a line that went nowhere. A man who did not want to be found, yet called twice. He stood. Without his coat, without explanation, He left the office and walked back out into the rain. He didn't go far, just 2 streets over, to Rue du Parc Royal, a quiet, narrow lane near the Marais, lined with buildings that once housed nobility and now mostly housed accountants, dentists, widows. He walked slowly, glancing not up at the windows but down toward the thresholds, and after 20 minutes he found it. A small white envelope, damp at the edges, placed neatly against the door of a narrow, respectable building with green shutters and a broken brass bell. He looked at it for a long time before stooping. It was identical to the one from his apartment. Inside, another 5-franc piece. He didn't ring the bell. He made a note of the address, number 17, and continued. Within another half hour, he found 2 more, one on Rue du Pont-au-Choux, another on Rue du Perche. Each was placed with care. Always a coin, always no name. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, his shoes were soaked, and his coat hem was dark with rainwater. He laid the 3 new envelopes on his desk, unsealed. The coins, 4 now, sat in a row, unshining and silent. Lapointe came in with fresh coffee and frowned at the collection. "Any idea what it means?" he asked. "No," Maigret said. "But someone is leaving coins in front of locked doors, and he wants us to know it. Charity." Maigret shook his head. "A beggar doesn't wrap 5 francs in paper, and a benefactor doesn't ring twice." He sent Lucas out next, with a quiet instruction. "Walk the 4th and 3rd arrondissements. Don't make noise, don't knock. Just look, door by door, and tell no one why." By late afternoon, Lucas returned with a list. 7 more addresses, all in the same rough quadrant of the city. All had received identical envelopes in the last 2 days, all containing a single coin, all without explanation. None had been opened. In most cases, the recipients thought it was a mistake. Some had left it untouched. 1 or 2 had pocketed the coin without curiosity. Only one had reported it, a war widow on Rue Charlot, who had brought it to a neighborhood priest. "It feels like nothing," Lucas said, "but I can't shake it. There's something too orderly." Maigret said nothing. He sat in his chair, puffing quietly, his gaze on the rain now falling harder against the high windows. For him, it wasn't the coins. It was the silence in which they were left, a gesture done again and again, not to help, not to scare, simply to be done, and someone, somewhere waited for it to be noticed. That evening, he walked home rather than take the car. The rain had stopped, but the pavements gleamed under the street lamps, and his breath came out in slow, visible curls. He arrived home later than usual, and Madame Maigret had already covered the pot on the stove. She gave him a glance, said nothing, and set the table for 1. He ate in silence. Afterward, he sat in the armchair by the window, the same one he had sat in the morning before, and listened. Below, the boulevard moved in quiet procession. Bicycles, voices, the rustle of newspapers against legs. He watched until his eyelids drooped, and the cigarette in his fingers had burned nearly to the filter. Then, just as he was about to stand, there was a sound, not loud, just the softest whisper of a paper envelope being slipped under a door. His door. He didn't move right away. Then he rose, walked to the hallway, and stooped. There it was, a 4th envelope, matching the others exactly. But this time, there was no coin, just a folded scrap of paper. He opened it slowly. Inside, written in a tight, deliberate hand, were 4 words: "There are 12 doors." Maigret stared at the paper for a long time. Then he looked up, toward the door, and listened. Once more, for footsteps. He stood in the hallway longer than necessary, the note held lightly between his fingers, the envelope dropped to the floor beside his slipper. The building was quiet, too quiet for Paris even at that hour. He opened the door slowly and looked out into the corridor. It was empty, as expected. The door to Madame Brissaid's flat across the landing was closed. The staircase was dim, the overhead bulb buzzing softly as it always did. He waited, still nothing. No creak of steps, No fading shuffle of a coat against the wall. Whoever had left the note had disappeared again, quietly, deliberately, like mist pulling back into alleyways. He shut the door without locking it, returned to the kitchen, and laid the note flat on the oilcloth table beside the other envelope from the day before. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, not elegant, but careful, like someone tracing letters to make sure they did not betray a tremble. He stared at the words again. There are 12 doors. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a riddle. Not really. It was a fact, delivered like a weather report or a dry warning before an arrival. But what did it mean? 12 doors, like the ones already found. He had 4 coins, 7 additional locations, Lucas had confirmed. And this made 12, but he hadn't received 12 coins. He'd received 1. And now this note. He remained in the chair until his wife came back in with a folded tea towel and asked gently, "Is it another?" Yes. She didn't ask more. After 23 years, she had learned how to let silence settle between them. The way Maigret let it settle between himself and suspects. It was a silence that didn't press, but made space. That night, Maigret didn't sleep deeply. He lay half awake, listening to the city breathe, his ears trained for the sound of quiet footsteps or the slip of another envelope. But nothing came. By morning, the rain had returned, softer now, almost a drizzle against the windows. He left before 8 and returned to the office without breakfast. The portier had already arrived and was reading a newspaper folded neatly in half. He looked up at Maigret and stood. "There was something this morning," he said. "A call. A woman, no name given. She said she found an envelope outside her door. 5 francs, Rue des Francs Bourgeois." Maigret took out his notebook. Number 34. That made 12. He sat heavily at his desk, lit his pipe, and said nothing. Lapointe hovered. 12 doors, Lapointe said softly. Glancing at the note Maigret now unfolded on the blotter, Maigret gave a small nod, more to himself than the young inspector. Not random. This man he's counting, but what's he waiting for, or what is he choosing? Later that morning, Maigret left the office again, this time with Lapointe in tow. They walked, not far, just through the grid of streets they now knew too well. Rue des Trènes, Rue des Rosiers, Rue Vieille du Temple. Each address marked a door. Each door had received an envelope. Some were large buildings, some barely wider than a doorway. Some tenants had noticed, others hadn't. A few of the envelopes had been discarded, 2 had gone missing entirely. But it was number 17 on Rue du Parc Royal that drew Maigret to stop. The concierge was an older woman, with stiff arms and the kind of voice that had lost the habit of listening. She insisted no one strange had entered. No one ever did. Except the man with the hat, she added, almost as an afterthought. The one who keeps walking past and never knocking. Maigret turned. What hat? She frowned. Plain, grey felt. Like a teacher or a clerk might wear. Walks up to the door, looks at the letterboxes, then leaves. Did the same yesterday. No umbrella, wet shoulders. Maigret felt a small internal shift, not revelation but alignment. He and Lapointe walked back out, and stood beneath a dripping awning across the street. The sky above was leaden, heavy with indecision. Pedestrians passed without urgency. A child pulled a sled over wet pavement. A butcher's boy smoked behind a delivery van. What's he waiting for? Lapointe asked quietly. Maigret looked toward the green-shuttered door. He's looking, not delivering. Watching. For what? A pattern. They walked again, this time faster. The addresses, laid out on the map back at the office, had looked haphazard, but in person they began to form something less vague, not a shape but a rhythm. Each one within walking distance of the next. Each chosen with care. No overlapping professions, no duplicate names, no shared landlords, but all Maigret saw now carried something else in common. Loneliness. A widow. An old watchmaker. A young typist who lived alone. A man with a clubbed foot. A single mother. a reclusive violinist. One by one, each recipient had nothing of note to report, but everything in their eyes betrayed a certain solitude. That afternoon, Maigret returned to his office and did what others rarely thought to do. He read, not reports, not files, the old civil lists, tenancy records, census rolls. He looked not for crimes but for rhythms, tenants who stayed too long, or not long enough, names that showed up without profession, entries with no family marked. By the time twilight began to darken the windows, he had found a few names, nothing conclusive, but enough to trouble him. Lucas returned just after 6. "Another coin," he said. "This one brought to the station. A little girl found it on her father's grave." Maigret looked up sharply. "Grave?" Lucas nodded. "Père Lachaise. Near the west wall. Grave of an Edmond Carillon. Died 3 years ago. No known family." The envelope was tucked under a stone. Maigret stood slowly. 12 doors, he said. "Not all of them have hinges." They went to the cemetery together that evening, before full dark. A chill had settled over the tombs. The wind wound like a whisper through the narrow paths. The grave was modest, granite, weathered, the name half faded, but there, under the stone angel's foot, was the envelope, damp, curling at the edge. Inside, 5 francs. Maigret crouched slowly. The grave marker had no flowers, no fresh visits, no sign of anyone but moss and the occasional leaf. "Edmond Carillon," he said quietly. "No occupation listed. Do you want me to look him up?" Lapointe asked. Maigret shook his head. "I will. Tomorrow." They stood there a moment longer, then turned, their footsteps fading back toward the gate, the fog closing softly behind them. That night, Maigret sat again at his kitchen table, his coat still damp, the windows fogged. The note was beside his glass. "There are 12 doors," but now he knew it had not been a warning. It was a count, a ritual, a preparation. Somewhere, someone was moving toward a final step, and Maigret could feel it now. Not a plan, but a reckoning, one that had already begun. The next morning brought a brittle cold that cracked faintly beneath each step, and a wind that pulled at coat seams as Maigret walked, alone, toward the town registry on Rue des Archives. The buildings loomed with their usual weary dignity, the street lamps still flickered. The next morning brought a brittle cold that cracked faintly beneath each step, and a wind that pulled at coat seams as Maigret walked, alone, toward the town registry on Rue des Archives. The buildings loomed with their usual weary dignity, the street lamps still flickering, though the sun was up. His collar was turned high, his pipe tucked into his pocket unlit, his breath fogging the air in short bursts. He walked not with purpose but with presence, the slow, grounded pace of someone who knew the city was more likely to answer if not rush. Inside the registry office, the warmth was a stale relief. He showed his identification to the clerk, a narrow-eyed man, with ink-stained fingers, and the gaze of one accustomed to dusty silences, and asked for the death file of Edmond Carillon. The man disappeared into a back room without speaking, and returned after several minutes with a folder bound in green twine. Maigret thanked him, took the file to a side desk, and opened it. The man had died on an October evening 3 years ago. No relatives listed, no funeral service recorded. Cause of death, heart failure. Age 61. Occupation, former municipal employee. 1 emergency contact, crossed out. The file was thin, neglected, the kind that no one read except those who had to record it. Maigret flipped the final page and paused. There was an address, 8 Rue de Sévigné, a small boarding house, still operational. The name of the landlady was faintly scribbled in the corner. Madame Orgo Letelier. Maigret folded the file and left without further word. Outside, the cold had intensified, the sidewalks crusted with brittle frost. A newspaper vendor called out half-heartedly about a political scandal no one would remember by next week. Maigret made his way toward Rue de Sévigné on foot, taking quiet streets, following instinct more than direction. The city unfolded around him in its usual indifference, boots splashing, shutters clattering, a waiter sweeping water off the steps of a closed cafe. The boarding house was small, a narrow rectangle wedged between two taller buildings. Its shutters were closed on the upper floor, and the street-facing door bore a brass number 8, dulled with grime. He rang once and waited. After some time the door opened with a soft groan and a woman in her late 50s peered out. Large eyes, pale cheeks, a cardigan pulled close around her shoulders. "Yes. Madame Letelier?" "Yes. I'm Chief Inspector Maigret." Her face didn't change. She stepped aside to let him in. The hallway smelled faintly of damp wood and soup. The wallpaper had faded into the suggestion of flowers, and somewhere a radio played softly in a neighboring room. She led him to a small parlor where a fire struggled in the grate. He removed his coat, sat without being asked. "I'm looking into a man who once lived here." "Edmond Carolin." She blinked. "Yes. He was here. Quiet man. Died upstairs. Room 2. Did he have visitors?" "No. No one ever came. He paid on time, ate little, and said even less. I used to leave his supper outside his door. He wouldn't come to the table." Maigret nodded. "Did he leave anything behind?" She hesitated. "No furniture. Just some coins in a tin and a torn photograph. I sent it to the mairie, but I don't think they ever claimed it." He pulled the note from his coat pocket. "There are 12 doors." He laid it on the table. She looked at it. "That isn't his writing." "You're sure?" "I saw it once, when he signed the lease." His hand shook. Letters bent to the right. "This is too clean. This is someone else." Maigret tapped the corner of the note with his finger. "Do you remember any other tenants he spoke to, even once?" She shook her head, then paused. "There was a boy, not a tenant. Used to pass by in the afternoons. He'd wait across the street. Never came in. Carolyn sometimes looked through the curtains when the boy was there. They never spoke." Maigret looked up. "What kind of boy?" "Thin, fair-haired. Not a student. The sort that carries odd parcels but never has a bag. Seemed too old to be doing errands. But he waited, day after day." He stood slowly. "Do you remember the boy's name?" She thought, then shook her head. "He never spoke. But I remember one thing. One day, I heard someone call out from the street. Henri." The boy didn't turn, but I remember the name. It sounded wrong in that silence. Maigret thanked her. "Asked to see room 2. She nodded without standing and pointed toward the stairs. It was a small room, even smaller, with a door closed behind him. A cot, a wash basin, a cracked window, and wallpaper that peeled faintly at the seams. There was nothing personal, but the air felt heavy, like something had once lived there and pressed itself into the walls. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands in his pockets, and listened, not to the house, but to the feeling. Caroline had died here. Quietly, alone. But someone had watched him. Someone had chosen that place, that person, and remembered, enough to leave a coin on his grave, enough to include him among the 12. Back at the office, the silence was sharper. Lucas and Laponte looked up when he entered. Neither spoke, but their expressions asked. He closed the door behind him. "We need a list. Not just the addresses, the names, the tenants." Lucas furrowed his brow. "You think they're connected?" Maigret didn't answer at first. He walked to the window, looked out over the dull sky above the sign. Then, they weren't chosen at random. Each was watched. Each lived quietly, alone. They've been followed, one by one. Marked. By who? He turned. A man. Perhaps a boy. He doesn't want to harm them. Not in the way we think. He wants to complete something. A gesture. A map. Lapointe tilted his head. A map of what? Maigret lit his pipe. The match flared briefly in the dimness. Regret. They worked late. Lapointe traced names from housing records. Lucas called clerks. and night concierges. Maigret returned to the addresses, one by one, this time asking for surnames. Each person had lived there quietly for years. Few friends, fewer family. All survived. All unharmed. But all had something missing. Not in themselves but in their lives. Something unwitnessed. By midnight, the list was complete. 12 names, 12 addresses, 1 grave, and the trace of a boy called Henri, whose name no one really knew. Maigret stood over the list and felt a soft, slow chill move along the back of his neck. The coins weren't tokens. They were markers. The question was not who would be next, but whether someone had already been last. The next morning was brittle and pale, the sky above Paris offering only a smear of gray beyond the rooftops. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres just before 8, his coat still smelling faintly of tobacco and damp stone. The corridor was quiet, a typist humming somewhere down the hall, the radiators clanking in their usual unsympathetic rhythm. He walked directly to his office, lit his pipe without removing his coat, and unfolded the list again. 12 names, each one now inked in his own careful hand. Some were known to him now by face, others only by address and quiet repetition. Lucas entered a moment later, a cup of coffee in one hand, and a faint crease of concern in his brow. He placed the cup on the desk, without a word, then glanced at the list. "We've checked on all of them," he said. "Nothing unusual. They're all accounted for. Living, going about their routines." Maigret nodded, but didn't look up. "And the girl?" Lucas hesitated. "Which girl?" "Rue de Franc-Bourgeois, typist. Name was Léonie Granger." Lucas nodded. "I spoke with her neighbor. She's still at work. Leaves at 8, returns by 6. She hasn't mentioned anything." "She won't," Maigret said. "Not unless she's asked the right way." There was a knock. Appointe stepped in, his coat still on, holding a folder speckled with rain. "I found something. About the boy." Henri. Maigret looked up sharply. "Not a surname," Lapointe said, "but a pattern. I traced names from the school records near Rue du Parc Royal. In 1943 there was a Henri Lemaitre, no parents listed, placed into clerical training by the state after the war, never finished, vanished from the rolls in 1949. Maigret stood slowly. How old would he be now? Early 30s, possibly 35. And where? Nowhere officially, no record since he left training. But I traced a temporary postal address from 5 years ago. Rue de la Corderie, a studio above a locksmith's shop, rented under the name H. Lemaitre. Maigret was already moving toward the door. "Come." They left the Quai on foot. The air had warmed slightly, though a fine drizzle clung to the cobblestones, making the streets shimmer. Rue de la Corderie lay tucked behind a row of shuttered workshops, its facade unremarkable, its windows smeared with dust. The locksmith was open. A man in a brown apron looked up as they approached, his expression guarded until Maigret identified himself. "Lemaitre?" the man repeated, scratching his chin. "Yes." He stayed above for a while. Quiet fellow. Kept odd hours. Always paid in coins. Never spoke unless spoken to. "When did he leave?" The locksmith shrugged. 2, maybe 3 years ago. Just disappeared. Left the key on the counter. "Did he leave anything behind?" "Not much. A tin box. Some drawings. I threw most of it out." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Drawings?" The man disappeared into a back room, then returned with a shallow box. Inside were curled scraps of yellowed paper, charcoal sketches, crude outlines of buildings, doorways, windows. Some had numbers, others had initials. There was no signature, only the repetition of single forms, thresholds, frames, stairs. Maigret studied one closely. It showed a long hallway with 12 doors, each marked by a number. Door 7 was shaded. He set it aside. "I'll take these." Back at the Quai, Maigret spread the sketches on his desk and stared at them in silence. The others stood nearby, not speaking, The charcoal lines seemed almost childlike, the sort of drawing someone might make not to plan something, but to remember it. He arranged them according to the addresses. Then slowly he began to see it. A rhythm, a narrowing. The same hallway appeared more than once. Once with 12 doors, once with 11, then 9, then 6. In each, more of the doors were blacked out. "Do you see?" he said softly. Lucas leaned in. "They're disappearing." "No. They're being crossed off." Lecompte frowned. "But none of them are dead." "Not in body," Maigret said. "But something is being completed." He stood again. Moved to the window. Rain tapped faintly at the glass. Somewhere below, a truck rumbled past, trailing the scent of damp cardboard and cold diesel. He drew on his pipe, the smoke slow and bitter. "This is not about murder. It's about memory. Someone is trying to preserve something before it fades." Lucas looked down at the drawings. "Like a ritual." Maigret nodded. "Or a farewell." The door opened quietly. A clerk stepped in. "Excuse me, Inspector. A man's come in asking for you. Says it's personal." Maigret turned. "Name?" The clerk hesitated. "He wouldn't give one, but he asked for you by name. And said, it's about the doors." Maigret's eyes flicked to Lecompte. "Bring him in." Moments later, a man entered. Thin, fair-haired, face pale as porcelain. He wore a gray felt hat in his hands, twisting it slowly. His coat was soaked, though he didn't seem cold. He stood near the doorway, posture tense, eyes scanning the sketches. Maigret said nothing. The man cleared his throat. "I thought you would find me. Eventually." Maigret nodded once. "You left 12 coins." The man blinked once. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because they needed to be marked. Before I forgot them. Before they disappeared." Maigret walked toward him slowly, not in menace, but in presence. "Who were they?" The man's voice softened. "People I saw. Every day. For years. I delivered things, ink, tea, packets, repairs. They were always there, always alone. They never knew I watched. But I did. I watched and remembered. Because no one else would." "Why 12? The man looked down at his hands. "Because there were 13. Silence fell. The sketches rustled faintly in the draft. "Who was the 13th? The man lifted his eyes. "Me." Maigret took a breath. The moment hung without drama, just the weight of its own gravity. Then he stepped aside. "Come." The man obeyed. Slowly, carefully, he folded his coat and placed it over his knees like a shroud. Maigret poured coffee. No one else spoke. Outside, the rain thickened again, tracing long lines down the glass. They would not arrest him. There was no law against remembrance. No crime in placing coins at thresholds of sorrow. But still, Maigret watched him for a long time, and saw the truth settle in the soft slump of his shoulders. The case had not been one of justice. It had been one of silence, and it had ended, as all such cases did, with a man admitting he had simply tried not to vanish. The man's name, when he finally gave it, was Henri Lemaitre. He said it without hesitation, not proudly, but with a kind of quiet resignation, as if he had known for some time that the name would eventually need to be spoken aloud again. Maigret made no note of it at first. He simply watched him over the rim of his pipe, the way one watches a candle burning lower, not to see when it goes out but to observe how it carries on until it does. Henri sat with his coat folded on his knees, his hat still in his hands, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the edge of the desk. He did not fidget, he did not ask for anything. He only responded when asked, and even then his answers came slowly, like thoughts arriving from far away. "I didn't mean harm," he said eventually, almost as if Maigret had accused him, though he hadn't spoken for several minutes. "I only wanted to remember them, as they were, before I forgot their shapes." "The 12?" Maigret asked. Henry nodded. They didn't know each other. That's the part that kept me going. They passed one another on the street sometimes, maybe brushed shoulders near market stalls, but never once did I see two of them speak. And still, each one of them was known to me. I watched them for years. I knew when they opened their curtains, when they left milk to sour, when they sat by the window and waited for nothing. Lapointe, who sat behind Henry, shifted slightly, but said nothing. Maigret leaned forward. And Edmond carry on? Henry's eyes darkened, the only shift in his otherwise placid expression. He was the first. He never spoke to me, but once, just once, he looked at me, through the window, just looked, as if he saw me. Not as a delivery boy, not as a ghost, just me. And I never forgot that look. Maigret, let the words settle. You visited his grave, he said quietly. Henry nodded. I had to. He had no visitors. Not even in death. I thought if I left the coin there, it would anchor him. As if someone had marked him once, just so he wouldn't vanish entirely. And the envelopes? Henry blinked. That was my ritual. I don't know why it had to be envelopes. I suppose because they felt formal. Private. A way to say, I saw you. You existed. This coin is not for spending. It's a seal. You left 12, Maigret said. Henry gave a slow nod. Yes, but there were 13 drawings. Silence stretched again. Henry looked down at his hat, tracing its brim absently with one thumb. The 13th was always meant to be me, he said. The last door, the one that never closed properly. I was part of it, a witness, but not separate. The list wouldn't be complete unless I marked myself. Maigret spoke quietly. You were going to leave a coin at your own door. Henry didn't answer. Not with words. He gave a small movement, half nod, half shrug, that said everything. There was no plan for what would follow, only the act itself, the placement, the closure. A ritual meant not for attention, but for completion. Maigret stood slowly, circled the desk and picked up one of the charcoal sketches. The hallway, the numbered doors, the shading. He turned the paper and looked at Henry. You drew this as it happened? Henry shook his head. No, I drew it before. I had all 12 doors mapped in my mind for years. I kept imagining the shape of the world if they were the only rooms in it. A hallway that only I could walk. And with every envelope one door would close, quietly, until only one remained. Maigret returned to his seat and placed the drawing down without a word. Lapointe spoke finally. What would have happened when the last door closed? Henry exhaled softly. Nothing. That was the point. Nothing dramatic. No end. Just a silence where once there had been shape. Maigret said nothing for a long time. He let the silence build, not as interrogation, but as space. Space for Henri's presence to fill, space for the weight of his solitude to make itself understood. He recognized something in the man, not illness, not instability, something more difficult to name. A kind of interior exhaustion. The fatigue of a man who had lived too long inside his own attention, with no one to reflect him back. You're not being charged, Maigret said quietly at last. There's no crime in remembering people. Even if you were the only one who ever saw them. Henry didn't react. It was as if the words slid past him. Too light to land, too light to land, too light. The next morning brought a brittle cold that cracked faintly beneath each step, and a wind that pulled at coat seams as Maigret walked, alone toward the town registry on Rue des Archives. The buildings loomed with their usual weary dignity, the street lamps still flickering. But Maigret continued. You can't go on marking people. Not this way, not in secret, not when no one knows what it means. You've stirred more unease than you realize. I know, Henry said. That was never my aim. Maigret stood again. Where do you live now? I don't. Henry said simply. I sleep in transit stations, waiting rooms, sometimes the hallways of buildings I used to deliver to. No one notices anymore. That's the difference now. Maigret nodded. He took a piece of paper from the blotter and wrote an address. It was a modest boarding house run by an old friend's widow in the 14th arrondissement. Quiet, clean, anonymous enough to suit someone like Henry. He handed the note across the desk. "You'll go there tonight," he said. "You'll rest, and you'll stay still. No more coins, no more doors. If you want to remember them, write, draw. But leave the city out of it." Henry took the paper, looked at it for a long time, and folded it neatly. "I'll go," he said. "I think I've finished anyway." Maigret watched him as he left the room, escorted by Lepant, but not held. There was nothing to hold him for. The man was not a criminal. He was a mourner, though the deaths he grieved had not yet occurred, and perhaps never would. When the door closed, Maigret stood and walked to the window. Paris continued below, indifferent and blurred through the rain. People moved in folds of gray and black, their umbrellas like floating commas. Nothing had changed. And yet something had. Lucas stepped into the doorway. "Do you believe him?" Maigret didn't turn. "Yes." "What if he disappears again?" Maigret lit his pipe. "Then he disappears. That's the way of such people. But he wanted to be found. That's what matters." He returned to his desk and sat. The sketches remained in a small stack at his elbow. Not evidence, not exhibits, just remnants. The charcoal memory of someone who refused to forget. That night, Maigret walked home in the rain without his umbrella. The sky hung low over the boulevard, the gaslight reflecting on the slick pavement like candlelight on water. He passed shuttered cafes, glowing bakeries, and closed florist shops with their buckets of wilting petals. On his doorstep, there was nothing. No envelope, no coin. Only the quiet press of the key in his pocket and the weight of 12 doors behind him, now closed. The next morning the sky was the color of dishwater, the clouds thick but withholding. Maigret arrived at the office without pause for breakfast, his coat still damp from the walk, and his pipe clenched loosely between his teeth, unlit. He moved past the rows of desks and soft murmurs without speaking, went straight to his office, and closed the door with a firm, familiar ease. He didn't remove his coat. Instead, he stood at the window for several minutes, watching the scene move under the Pont Saint-Michel like a ribbon of slow tarnish. The air behind the glass thick with a cold that came not from weather but from memory. There had been no word from Henry, no confirmation that he'd reached the boarding house. Maigret hadn't expected any. The sort of man who marked the doors in silence, did not leave messages. He existed only in movement, or in retreat. Lucas arrived shortly after 9, setting a small stack of papers on the desk and waiting for Maigret to acknowledge him before speaking. "I sent a plainclothes man to the boarding house," he said quietly. "Henry slept there last night. The landlady said he asked for a quiet room, paid for 3 nights in coins, and said almost nothing." Maigret gave a small nod. She said he was polite. Too polite. As if he didn't want to touch the air. "He won't stay long," Maigret said. "He's not built for permanence." Lucas hesitated. "There's something else. We had a call this morning, from a postman in the 10th. Said he found an envelope on his route, taped to a door." Maigret turned. "A coin?" "Yes. 5 francs. He rose from his chair slowly, the fatigue of the last few days weighing more in his knees than in his eyes. The sketch of the hallway lay still on his blotter. 12 doors, 3 shaded, 1 faintly smudged. He looked at it, then at Lucas. Was it one of the original addresses? No. New. Rue du Faubourg Saint-Martin. 3rd floor. Tenant's name is Jacques Nevers. Maigret took his coat again. "Come." The apartment was in a modest building, just above a tobacconist. The stairwell smelled of oil and damp cement, and the walls bore the faint greenish tint of age. They climbed in silence. At the 3rd floor, a narrow landing branched left and right. The door to number 32 was closed. Nothing remarkable about it but the residue of tape marks near the handle. Maigret knocked twice, gently. A moment later, the door opened. A man of about 50 stood in the threshold, hair thinning, cardigan buttoned at the throat. His eyes were cautious but not suspicious, the kind of caution that came from long solitude, not guilt. He looked first at Maigret, then at Lucas, then stepped back with the slow weariness of someone not used to visitors. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret," Maigret said, stepping in. "This won't take long." The room was sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a stove, no personal effects visible, but a faded photo on the windowsill. A woman in a sunlit garden, her eyes half-shadowed. Maigret gestured gently toward the door. "You found an envelope this morning?" "Yes," the man said. "It was taped to the wood. I thought it was a mistake at first, just a blank envelope. But there was a coin inside, 5 francs, old. You didn't recognize the handwriting?" "There wasn't any." Maigret studied him for a moment, then asked, "Do you know Henri Lemaitre?" The man shook his head. "No." "Have you seen him before?" The man hesitated. "A boy used to pass by. A few years ago, carried a parcel sometimes. Thin, didn't speak." "Did he ever speak to you?" "Once," the man said. "He asked me if I lived alone." Maigret's eyes didn't move. "And you told him yes?" The man gave a short nod. "I thought it was for a census, or a delivery record. I didn't think anything of it." Maigret looked around the room again. The photo, the neatness, the silence. Another door in Henri's hallway. He thanked the man and left without another question. Outside on the steps, Lucas asked, "So he's still doing it?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. He took out his pipe, tapped the bowl twice against his palm, then said, "No. That coin was left before we spoke to him. Maybe days before, he was completing his pattern. That was one of the last. But then why leave it after the list was done?" Maigret gave a slow exhale. "Maybe it was always 13. They walked back in silence. The city around them was indifferent. Wheels turning on wet stone, cafe awnings sagging under mild wind. A couple arguing gently over a newspaper in a bus shelter. The ordinary rhythm of lives moving unseen. The rhythm Henri had traced in his own quiet way. Back at the office, a telegram was waiting. It had been sent from a corner postbox in the 14th arrondissement. It read only, "I left the last one today. I won't leave more. I'm finished." Yet, Maigret folded it slowly. The act of receiving the message felt heavier than the message itself. Henri was not saying goodbye. He was saying that the ritual is done. Maigret remained at his desk for most of the afternoon. He did not issue further orders. There was no one left to interview, no crime to solve, no threat to prevent, just a silence that now belonged to the city again, no longer shaped by Henri's footsteps, but by the same anonymity that had preceded him. As dusk approached, Maigret left the office alone. He walked without hurry, pipe unlit, coat turned up, the mist beginning again in the corners of the sky. He crossed into the 4th arrondissement and made his way to Rue du Parc Royal. The green-shuttered building stood exactly as before, narrow, polite, unconcerned. He stood across the street and looked at it, the windows dim behind the curtain. Then he turned and walked a path he hadn't walked in years, one of quiet corners and silent courtyards. Past a small alley, with no name, into a back street where the gas lamps flickered slightly uneven. He stopped before a building he had once visited during a case long closed, a building he remembered not for the crime, but for a woman who had lived there, one who had spoken of how many people pass through life like furniture, useful, present, but unseen. Maigret stood there a long time, not looking for Henri, not waiting, just remembering. The quiet shape of things before they are gone. And as he turned finally to walk home, he felt something in his coat pocket shift. He reached in. It was a 5 francs piece. And dull. Familiar. No envelope. No note. Only weight. Maigret held the coin between his fingers, feeling the shallow ridges of Marianne's profile worn almost smooth by time. And handling. It was not new. It was not old. It was simply there, unremarkable in any ordinary context. Yet in this moment it carried a pressure that seemed heavier than metal should allow. He turned it over once, then again, then tucked it carefully into his coat pocket without thinking, not quite hiding it, not quite preserving it, only keeping it close. He did not mention it to Lucas the next day, nor to Lapointe. There was no report to be filed, no official context in which the appearance of that fifth coin belonged. The story, as far as the service judiciaire was concerned, had closed, quietly, without scandal, without punishment. The files remained blank. The hallway of 12 doors had been crossed and recrossed by a man who had left no footprints, only envelopes, and now, even he had receded. But Maigret did not forget. He carried the weight of that final coin in his coat for the better part of the week, sometimes forgetting it was there until his fingers brushed against it during idle moments, while standing at a cafe counter, while folding a handkerchief, while searching for his lighter in the dark corners of the inner pocket. Each time it resurfaced, it brought with it the unmistakable sense of being watched. Not in a sinister way, but in a way that suggested a memory had attached itself to him. That somewhere in the folds of the city, Henri Lemaitre still moved in silence. On Thursday, Maigret received a letter. It was addressed in the same narrow hand that had penned the note about the 12 doors. The envelope was unadorned, bearing only his name. No return address. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. "There is no need to answer," it read. "But I thought you should know that I left the city. Not out of shame, nor fear. I had to, because the list was beginning again. In my head, I would see faces and count them without trying. I would pass a window and feel the number creeping up. 13, 14, 15. I didn't want it to begin again. There was no signature. Just space." Maigret read the letter twice, then a third time. He placed it gently in the drawer of his desk, beside a stack of unused blotters and an old penknife. He did not mention it to anyone. It was not part of any file. But he sat back that day and stared out the window for a long time, pipe unlit, the sky hanging low over the city like a held breath. A few days later he stopped by Rue des Francs Bourgeois, not officially, not as part of any follow-up. He simply walked there on the way home, his coat collar turned up against a dry wind. Léonie Grangier, the typist, was just leaving the building, her gloved hands clutching a small cloth bag. She was young, but not so young that Maigret could mistake her weariness for innocence. She glanced at him, uncertain, then remembered him, not from conversation but from his eyes. "You were here last week," she said. Maigret nodded. "I was. You asked my neighbor questions." "I did." She looked down, adjusting the strap on her bag. "Was something wrong?" "No," he said softly. "But you received something, didn't you?" She blinked. "You mean the coin?" "Yes." She looked over her shoulder, then back at him. "I didn't think it meant anything. I thought maybe someone left it by mistake. I almost spent it. But then, I don't know. I kept it." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because it felt like someone had noticed me." Maigret nodded. They had. She didn't ask who, and he didn't offer. They stood there a moment longer, sharing the quiet, until she said, "It's strange. After I found it, I started watching my neighbors more closely. I'd never realized how quiet the building was, how no one really knows anyone else here." Maigret looked up at the pale facade, the windows closed against a spring chill that hadn't yet faded. Most people don't notice each other until they're gone. She nodded slowly. Then, without another word, she walked off down the narrow street, her heels tapping evenly against the stone. The next day brought a small envelope to the Quai des Orfèvres. No address, just left at the front desk by an errand boy who couldn't describe who had handed it to him. Inside were 2 photographs, grainy, soft-edged, clearly taken from a distance. In one, a man sat on a bench beneath the trees of the Jardin des Plantes, shoulders hunched, eyes on the pigeons. In the other, he was crossing a bridge. Maigret recognized a footbridge outside Lyon. In both it was unmistakably Henri. Maigret placed the photos side by side, on his desk. The man had gone. Yes. But he was not hiding. He was simply somewhere else, observing again, trying to remain invisible until his own presence forced him to move. He let out a long breath and rubbed his thumb across the corner of one photo. Somewhere, another hallway was forming. This time in Henri's mind, perhaps never to be acted upon, perhaps only a mental map he would carry forever. That evening, as Maigret walked home along the boulevard, he passed a small bakery preparing to close. A girl stood inside sweeping flour off the tiles, humming softly to herself. No one was watching her. No one ever did. But Maigret paused just long enough to see the rhythm of her arms, the way her hair had slipped loose from its tie, the slight curve of her lips as she remembered something that had nothing to do with the broom or the clock. He moved on, more slowly now, and realized that Henri's ritual, however strange, however private, had not been meaningless. It had reminded Maigret of something he'd known all along and forgotten amid arrests and reports and hollow confessions. That every face on every street bore its own invisible story, and the greatest violence in life was not to harm someone, but to never see them at all. At home, he placed the 5-franc piece on his bedside table. He did not label it. He did not put it away. And for the first time in many months, Maigret slept without waking in the middle of the night, listening for footsteps that were no longer there. Spring settled slowly over Paris, not in a burst of bloom, but in a slow unfurling of light, the kind that edged in early through high windows and softened the stone of buildings until they looked almost warm. Maigret noticed the change more in the sounds than in the sights, the shift in footsteps from heavy to brisk, the reappearance of voices in courtyards, the soft, metallic rattle of bicycles returned to the streets. People once hidden behind scarves and windows now lingered a moment longer near corners, looking without knowing why. He had not heard from Henri again. Not by letter, not by photograph, but that did not trouble him. There were certain people who, once you understood them, didn't need to be followed. They moved with the weight of their own ghosts, and when they disappeared it wasn't to flee, it was to avoid disturbing the air. The coin remained on Maigret's bedside table, untouched. He hadn't moved it, hadn't covered it, hadn't placed it in a drawer. It had become like an old matchbox or a loose button, not meant to be used, but still somehow necessary to the order of things. Every morning he glanced at it, not deliberately, but inevitably, as if the act reminded him that certain stories didn't end with arrests or paperwork, but with presence and quiet. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the days returned to their usual rhythm. The reports resumed. Brawls in the 11th, a string of pickpocketings near the metro, a butcher who accused his nephew of stealing receipts. There was a man who had locked himself in his attic and refused to speak for 3 days, only to emerge hungry and humiliated. Nothing grand, nothing brutal, just life at its strangest and smallest. All of it filtered through the familiar murmur of floorboards and files and hallway coughs. But one morning, something arrived that broke the rhythm. It was a small brown package, wrapped in butcher paper, tied with string, and left in the front lobby with Maigret's name written in block letters, not Henri's hand. The concierge swore no one had seen who left it. Lucas brought it in with his usual quiet caution, and set it on the desk. Maigret looked at it for a moment before untying the string. Inside was a box, wooden, unvarnished, no markings. He opened it. It contained coins. Not a fortune, just a dozen 5-franc pieces, arranged in a row on a folded cloth, each with a small scrap of paper tucked beneath it. He lifted one. The handwriting was different from Henri's, less deliberate, less careful, more unsure, but the words were familiar. She waited in the window at 6 each evening. He never came. Still, she waited. The next note read, "He polished the same shoes for 20 years. The soles wore thin. He never replaced them." And another. She sang once, long ago. I heard her through the walls. No one else ever did. Maigret didn't speak. Lucas watched from near the door, waiting, as if for the coins to turn into something else. Not Henri, Maigret said finally, quietly. But someone who knew of him. Lucas, stepped forward. A copycat? No, Maigret said, shaking his head. A witness. Or someone Henry spoke to before he left. Someone who listened. He read through all 12 scraps. Each was an observation, not a confession, not a cry for attention, just memories, slight and unspoken. The kind of truths no one ever wrote down. People remembered in the details no one else noticed. A crooked lampshade, a garden left unweeded, a door closed too gently. Each coin marked one of them. Is it dangerous? Lucas asked. Maigret looked up slowly. No. It's a continuation. He did not call a meeting. He did not send the box to forensics. He closed it gently and placed it in his desk drawer beside Henry's first sketch of the hallway and the final unsigned letter. That afternoon, he took a walk. It was not for any case. He moved through the 4th arrondissement, his coat open, his pipe unlit, passing bakeries with windows steamed over and bookstores with paperbacks stacked like cards. He passed people, old, young, alone, laughing, waiting. At a small public bench he paused and sat, more to feel the city than to rest. Pigeons bobbed near his feet, and a little girl spilled a bag of almonds while trying to open a juice bottle. No one noticed her except her mother. No one else turned. The next morning brought a brittle cold that cracked faintly beneath each step, and a wind that pulled at coat seams as Maigret walked, alone, toward the town registry on Rue des Archives. The buildings loomed with their usual weary dignity, the street lamps still flickering. He wondered how many others like Henri had been watching. How many people had stood in doorways with a memory they could not place. Was this what it became now, a city of silent archivists, each carrying stories that would never be told unless slipped beneath envelopes? Back at the office, another letter was waiting for him. This one was addressed in the same new hand as the notes in the coin box. It read, "You once said there was no crime in remembering. I believe you. He left me the sketch, the one with the 12 doors. I didn't understand it at first, but I've begun drawing my own now. It helps me sleep. I don't plan to leave coins. Just paper. Just the shape of someone who..." There was no name, but Maigret folded the letter carefully and placed it with the rest. The case had not grown louder. It had grown quieter. That evening he arrived home before dark. Madame Maigret had already prepared dinner, the table set with its small comforts, bread, wine, the familiar smell of something slow cooked. She smiled when she saw him and said only, "You're early, just today," he murmured. After dinner he walked to the bedroom and looked at the coin on his table. It had not moved. He left it there, but in the drawer, where he kept a few personal things, his old knife, a pressed flower from his first trip with her to Vichy, a crumpled note he had once found in a case long buried. He placed something new, a small square of paper. On it, written in his own rough hand. He left the office at dusk each day. No one asked why he walked. But he always passed the same bakery, and always slowed when the girl was sweeping. He closed the drawer gently. There was no case now, but something remained. A way of seeing, a way of keeping. A few mornings later, Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres a little earlier than usual. The sky was just beginning to lighten over the rooftops, a pale strip of silver above the river. He paused before entering the building, watching the slow sweep of a street cleaner brushing wet leaves into the gutter. The air smelled of coffee grounds and the damp paper of yesterday's news. He lit his pipe and stood there a moment longer, the smoke curling faintly around his collar before fading. Inside, the corridors still echoed with morning emptiness. The typists had not yet arrived, and the sounds came mostly from steam hissing through old pipes and distant footsteps on tile. His office was cold. He opened the window slightly to let the cold in, rather than fight it. There were no new cases on his desk, nothing urgent, but he found himself opening the drawer anyway, the one where he kept the wooden box, the hallway sketch, the letters, the folded scraps of memory. He took out the most recent envelope again, the one not signed, the one from whoever had continued Henry's quiet ritual. The ink had already begun to fade slightly, where the curve of the paper had pressed against the edge of the box. He stared at it for a while, not rereading, just holding the words in his mind like a held breath. There was no pretense in them, no exhibitionism, only the strange dignity of someone choosing to remember what had been small and unsaid. By 10 o'clock, the building had filled with life. Detectives moving between offices, typists carrying carbons, Janvier talking loudly about a petty theft on the Rue Mouffetard. A boy had stolen 2 eclairs from a bakery and left an IOU in blue crayon. It made the rounds like a joke. Lucas came in with a light knock. "There's something," he said, more serious. "It might be nothing, but I thought you'd want to see it." He placed a newspaper on Maigret's desk. Le Matin, folded to page 3. A small column on the right, barely 2 inches wide, carried the heading, "Man Found Sleeping in Library Cloister." It wasn't much of a story. A night guard at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève had discovered a man curled in a cloister alcove behind the archives, apparently not a vagrant, clean, quiet, with a small bag of coins and several folded sketches. He had given no name, offered no resistance, and had asked only not to be photographed. The police had let him go with a warning. Maigret read the article twice. "Henry?" Lucas asked. "Possibly." Maigret said, "You want me to look into it?" "No. Let it be." Lucas hesitated. "You're sure?" "I am." He waited until Lucas had gone before unfolding the map of the 12 doors again. Henry's first sketch. The hallway still ran its silent length, each door marked, each line drawn by a man who had measured the world in absences. He studied it, then opened the new box again. The latest editions were clearly made by another hand, but they followed the same rhythm. Scraps of memory, each beneath a coin. The notes weren't meant for anyone. That was the thing. They weren't messages. They were acknowledgments. Maigret looked down at the most recent. He ordered tea every day, even though he drank coffee. The girl behind the counter thought he liked it. He didn't correct her. Another. Her curtains were always drawn at sunset. Not to keep anyone out, but to stop herself from looking for someone who never came back. He closed the box, gently. Then he stood and walked out into the corridor. There were days when he resented the modern world, its need for speed, for documentation, for noise. But today, he felt strangely at ease with the quiet it allowed in certain corners. Henry had not vanished. Not truly. He had become part of something else, something Maigret could not name, but recognized instinctively. That afternoon, Maigret took a different route home. He passed by Rue Charlotte and paused outside number 19, one of the original 12 addresses. The building stood unchanged, its windows reflecting the soft gray of the sky. He looked up, letting his eyes rest for a moment on the top floor, where the war widow had once lived. The one who'd received a coin but never understood it. He had never spoken to her directly, but he imagined her now, perhaps by a window, knitting or preparing tea, unaware that her presence had once been marked by someone who had seen her. He moved on. Further down, near a small bakery, he passed the girl again, the one who swept the flour each evening. She saw him this time. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled, faintly, then looked away, but he could see in her posture that she had remembered him from before. She did not know why he watched, only that someone had. When he arrived home, Madame Maigret was preparing lentils, the smell of garlic and thyme filling the kitchen. She looked at him and said, "You look tired." He nodded. "I'm not." She poured wine into a small glass and handed it to him. "You've been thinking, always." They ate in silence, the kind that had grown between them over decades, not empty, but full of shared space. She never asked about the details. She had long understood that the things Maigret carried could not always be told aloud, but she knew when something had ended, or when it had turned into something else. Later that night, Maigret walked into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked again at the coin still resting on the table. The light from the hallway caught it just enough to throw a soft gleam across its rim. He reached for a piece of paper and wrote without thinking. He walked the same street every Friday at dusk, always alone, sometimes smiling. No one knew why. He folded it and placed it gently beneath the coin. Then he turned off the lamp and lay down, not to forget but to rest beside something that would not vanish because he had chosen to see it. The days turned longer, the sky over Paris softening into a constant wash of blue-gray, and with it, the city slipped into one of its quieter moods. No more letters arrived. No more coins. The wooden box in Maigret's drawer remained unopened now. Not from neglect, but because its purpose had finished. It was no longer a mystery to solve, but an artifact of something understood, not in evidence or confession, but in presence. A man had lived and left traces, another had seen and followed. And Maigret, who had only ever asked to know why, had come to the answer not through deduction, but through observation. He did not speak of Henry again. There were no files to close, no suspects to clear, but every so often a postcard would arrive from somewhere just outside the city. Étampes, Dreux, Poissy, unsigned, unremarkable. The sort sold for 1 franc at railway stations. On the back, never more than a line. Today, I remembered someone who never spoke. He limped slightly, but only when he was watched. I saw her again in a window. She had changed the curtains. Maigret never traced them. He never instructed anyone to watch the postmarks. He simply tucked them inside the box, each one a thread in the quiet fabric Henri had left behind. One morning in late spring, as he crossed the courtyard of the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret heard his name called. A young officer from downstairs, nervous in his posture. "Inspector, there's someone downstairs, asking for you." "Name?" Said he didn't have one. Just said he knew you'd remember the baker's girl. Maigret paused. He followed the boy back down, through the ground floor where the scent of cigarette ash and old coffee always seemed to cling. In the waiting area sat a man in his 20s, eyes sharp but untroubled, hands steady, a notebook tucked under one arm. He stood when Maigret entered, but did not smile. "I never met him," the man said, his voice even. "Henry. But he spoke of you, not often. Just once, when he left the sketch behind." Maigret studied him. "And you?" The man looked down. "I worked nights in the same building. One of the places he left a coin. He never told me why he watched people. Only that it kept him anchored, and that once he was seen by someone who didn't write him off as mad." "He asked you to continue?" "No. He didn't ask anything. But when he left, I found the first note under my door. A memory. It wasn't mine, but it felt like mine." Maigret nodded. Slowly, the man pulled the notebook from under his arm and handed it over. "It's nothing official. I'm not trying to be him. I'm not even sure what I'm doing. But I think there are things that need to be marked before they disappear." Maigret opened the notebook. Inside, page after page of brief notations. She always bought 2 apples, even when alone. He said good morning to the dog, but never the owner. She wore the same scarf for 10 years. No addresses, no names, just traces. Maigret handed it back. "Keep watching," he said, "but do it with kindness." The man nodded and left as quietly as he had come. That night Maigret walked home slower than usual. The city had that strange hush it wore before rain, not silence, but anticipation. He passed the bakery. The girl was not sweeping flour anymore. A boy now stood in her place, younger, distracted. Time had moved on. The door still creaked the same way. At home, Madame Maigret had left the radio on in the kitchen, playing something light and cheerful. She looked up from the stove and asked, "Another long day?" "Not long," Maigret said. "Just full." After dinner he went to the bedroom, removed his coat, and took the final coin from the bedside table. He weighed it in his palm a moment, then placed it gently in the box, with the others, letting it settle without a sound. Then he pulled a piece of paper paused, and wrote slowly. He watched until there was no one left to watch. Then he walked on. He folded it, placed it beneath the lid, and closed the drawer. Outside, the rain had begun, soft and persistent, washing the city clean in the dark. And for once, Maigret did not look back. Maigret did not look